It started like any other day. I clocked in at the Salem Public Library, just like I had for the past 5 years. The place had always been my refuge, a quiet corner of the world where I could lose myself in dusty books and the sound of pages turning. My name's Emily Carter, and I guess you could say I've always been drawn to stories. Fiction, biographies, history, it didn't matter. There's something comforting about diving into someone else's world, even if just for a little while. The library itself was nothing special at first glance. It was an old, sprawling building with creaky floors and that faint smell of mildew that never seemed to go away no matter how many times we aired it out. But for those of us who worked there, it held a certain charm. The place had character, like it had soaked up the secrets of every book it held over the years. And trust me, there were plenty of secrets. I'd just been promoted to senior librarian, which meant access to the basement archives, a perk that came with the responsibility of cataloging old, forgotten texts. Most people would think that sounded like a nightmare, but not me. The thought of uncovering something rare, something unseen for decades, gave me a weird sort of thrill. So when Mr. Henderson, our head librarian, handed me the keys to the basement, I was practically bouncing with excitement. "Careful down there," he said with a half smile. "Some of those shelves haven't been touched in years. Who knows what you'll find?" At the time, I thought he was joking. If only I'd known. The basement wasn't exactly inviting. The staircase creaked under my feet, and the single overhead light buzzed like it was about to die at any second. Still, there was something almost magical about being surrounded by so much history. Shelves lined the walls, packed tightly with books, scrolls, and manuscripts that looked like they hadn't seen the light of day in forever. I spent hours down there, flipping through crumbling pages and making notes of what needed to be restored or digitized. It was mostly dry stuff, municipal records, genealogy charts, that kind of thing. But then I noticed something odd. One of the shelves didn't sit flush against the wall like the others. It looked off, like it had been moved recently. Curiosity got the better of me, and I gave it a push. The shelf groaned, sliding just enough to reveal a narrow wooden door behind it. My heart skipped a beat. A hidden door? In my library? This was the kind of thing you only read about in books. I fumbled with the old rusted handle and gave it a tug. It took some effort, but eventually the door creaked open. The air inside was heavy, stale, and it smelled faintly of something metallic, like blood, but older. The room was pitch black, but I could make out the faint outlines of shelves. I turned on my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. Books, shelves and shelves of books, all bound in dark, weathered leather. There were no titles on the spines, no catalog numbers. It was like they didn't exist, not officially, anyway. A shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it. This was what I lived for, wasn't it? Discovering something no one else had seen in decades, maybe even centuries. One book stood out immediately. It was larger than the others, with a strange symbol embossed on the cover. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, almost like an eye, but not quite. My fingers tingled as I reached for it, and the second I touched the leather, a chill shot up my arm. I tried to shake it off. Probably just nerves, I told myself. I opened the book, and the first page was blank. So was the second, and the third. Just as I was about to close it, words began to appear on the next page, like they were being written in real time. The keeper watches. The reader awakens. I froze. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before the beam stabilized. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the words had already been there and I'd just missed them. But deep down, I knew better. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, like someone calling my name from far away. "Emily." I spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time, and closer. My heart pounded as I slammed the book shut and shoved it back onto the shelf. I practically sprinted out of the room, slamming the hidden door behind me. Back upstairs, the library seemed normal, quiet, calm, the way it always was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, as I locked up, I heard the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. "Emily." I told myself I was just tired, that I'd been working too hard. But as I turned off the lights and stepped outside, I couldn't help but glance back at the basement door. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been strange, fractured images of dark corridors and endless shelves of books that whispered as I walked by. But what haunted me most was the feeling I couldn't shake, that the book wasn't just in the library, it was in my head. I brushed it off as leftover adrenaline from the night before and made my way to work. The library felt normal when I arrived, calm, quiet, and just a little too empty, as it usually was on weekday mornings. I busied myself with the usual tasks, shelving returns, checking the catalog, making small talk with Mr. Henderson, who seemed none the wiser about the secret room in the basement. But the basement wouldn't leave my mind. The hidden door, the books, the whispering, it all felt like some surreal fever dream. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. When I descended the stairs, the air felt heavier, colder, like the basement was holding its breath. The hidden door was just as I'd left it, the wooden surface almost daring me to open it again. Part of me wanted to turn around, forget it ever existed, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. With a deep breath, I pushed the shelf aside and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it, dark, oppressive, and lined with those strange, untitled books. The one I'd touched last night was right where I'd left it, and despite every instinct telling me to leave it alone, I picked it up again. This time the words were already on the page. The keeper sees, the reader obeys. I swallowed hard. The words didn't just feel written. They felt alive, like they were pulsing with some kind of energy I couldn't understand. I flipped to the next page and found a list of names, written in an elegant looping script. The first few names were unfamiliar. Edward Finch, Miriam Doyle, Charles Beaumont. But the last name stopped me cold. Emily Carter. My stomach twisted. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank left by someone who'd found the room before me. That had to be it. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back onto the shelf, but as I turned to leave, the whispering started again. It wasn't faint this time. It was loud, clear, and everywhere. Emily, Emily, Emily. The whispers overlapped, growing louder and more insistent until I clamped my hands over my ears. It didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were in my head. I stumbled out of the room, my heart racing. As I shoved the hidden door closed, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt even more unnerving. Back upstairs, I tried to focus on work, but everything felt wrong. The light seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. And then there was the sound, a faint, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. No one else seemed to notice it, not even Mr. Henderson, who was humming to himself at the front desk. By the end of the day, I was on edge. My coworkers noticed. "You okay, Em?" Linda, one of the other librarians, asked as I locked up for the night. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. When I got home, I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the book. How did it know my name? And who were the other people on that list? I searched for them online, but nothing came up. No social media, no obituaries, nothing. It was like they didn't exist. That night, the dreams came back. This time, I was standing in the secret room, but it wasn't just a room anymore. It was a vast, endless library, with shelves stretching into a dark void. The books were alive, their pages fluttering like wings, and the whispers were everywhere, calling my name. "Emily, Emily, the reader must obey." I woke up drenched in sweat, the words ringing in my ears. I thought about calling in sick, but the thought of staying home alone scared me even more. The library felt different when I arrived, like it was watching me. I tried to ignore it and went about my day, but when I passed by the basement door, I couldn't stop myself from pausing. The whispers had started again, faint but unmistakable. They weren't coming from my head this time. They were coming from the basement. I should have left. I should have walked out of that library and never looked back. But instead, I found myself reaching for the door handle, and then I heard it, clear as day. "Come back, Emily." I froze. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was a low, guttural growl. Someone or something was waiting for me down there. I don't know why I went back down there. Maybe it was the pull of the whispers, the way they seemed to seep into my bones, or maybe it was the sheer morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. Either way, I found myself descending those creaky stairs once again, the faint sound of my own name echoing around me like a taunt. "Emily." The basement was darker than it had ever been. The overhead light flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The air was thick and heavy, almost hard to breathe, and that metallic smell was back, sharper this time, like something ancient and rotten was waiting for me. I reached the hidden door and paused, my hand trembling on the handle. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were urging me, coaxing me. "Open the door, Emily, you've come this far." With a deep breath, I shoved the door open. The hidden room looked the same as before, but it felt different, alive. The books seemed to vibrate on the shelves, their leather bindings almost glistening in the dim light. The large book with the strange symbol sat in the center, right where I'd left it. I stepped inside and the door creaked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot. My flashlight flickered and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the light steadied, I saw it, something moving just beyond the edge of the beam. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The shadows shifted and for a second, I thought I saw eyes, two glowing golden orbs staring at me from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Emily!" the voice growled, low and guttural, like it was scraping against my mind. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, my body trapped in place by an unseen force. The book on the pedestal flipped open on its own, the pages fluttering wildly before settling on a new page. "The reader must finish," the voice commanded. Against my will, I stepped forward. My hands reached out, trembling, as if they were being guided by something far beyond my control. I didn't want to touch the book, but I couldn't stop myself. The moment my fingers brushed the page, the world around me dissolved. The room vanished, replaced by a vast, empty void, filled with shifting shadows and glowing eyes. The air buzzed with energy, and the whispers became deafening, overlapping voices that pressed against my skull like a vice. Then I saw it, the creature. It was massive, its form writhing and shifting like smoke and shadow. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my mind unraveling, like every thought, every memory I'd ever had was being pulled apart, piece by piece. "You are the reader," it rumbled, its voice reverberating through the void. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "To release me." I shook my head, trying to pull away, but my hands were stuck to the book, the pages burning against my skin. The words were no longer written in ink. They were written in fire, their meaning searing into my mind. "The reader becomes the keeper," the creature said, its form drawing closer, "and the keeper feeds the words." "No!" I screamed, trying to yank my hands away, but it was no use. The book wouldn't let go. The pages turned on their own, faster and faster, each one pulling me deeper into its story. And then I saw it, my own life written out in perfect detail, each moment described like I was nothing more than a character in someone else's narrative. "This can't be real," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, but it is," the creature hissed. "You are mine now, Emily, just as those before you were." It gestured, and the names from the list appeared in the void, glowing like embers. Edward Finch, Miriam Doyle, Charles Beaumont. All of them had been readers before me, their lives consumed by the book, their stories unfinished. I was next. "No," I said again, more firmly this time. "You won't take me." Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I wrenched my hands free from the book. Pain shot through me like fire, but I didn't care. The void around me cracked and shattered, and I was back in the room, gasping for air. The creature roared, its fury shaking the walls. The book slammed shut on its own, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was still, but I knew it wasn't over. The book wasn't done with me. I stumbled out of the room, my legs barely holding me up. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again, a faint whisper, just loud enough to send chills down my spine. "Emily, you can't escape." And deep down, I knew it was right. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature, its shifting, shadowy form, its glowing eyes boring into me. The whispers followed me into my dreams, calling my name over and over, growing louder until I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. By morning, I was exhausted, but something had shifted in me. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, but now it was joined by something else, determination. I didn't know how, but I was going to end this. The book, the creature, the whispers, it all had to stop. When I arrived at the library, the building felt different. It wasn't just the oppressive air or the flickering lights. It was like the library itself was alive, watching me. I could feel it in the walls, the floors, the very air I was breathing. Mr. Henderson greeted me with his usual cheerful smile, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, like he was speaking to me through water. "Everything all right, Emily?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just need to finish some work in the basement." He didn't press further, and I was grateful for it. As I descended the stairs, I felt the familiar heaviness settle over me. The whispers started almost immediately, faint but insistent, like they'd been waiting for me. This time I didn't hesitate. I shoved the shelf aside and pushed open the hidden door. The room was the same as before, but the book was different. It was glowing faintly, its strange symbol pulsing like a heartbeat. I stepped inside, the whispers rising in intensity with every step. My fingers trembled as I reached for the book, but I didn't stop. "The reader returns," the creature's voice growled, low and resonant, echoing from the shadows. "I'm not here to read," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The book opened on its own, the pages flipping wildly before settling on a new passage. I recognized the words immediately. They were describing this exact moment, down to the trembling in my hands and the resolve in my voice. "You cannot escape your story, Emily," the creature said. Its form began to materialize, rising from the shadows like smoke. "You are mine." "No," I said, clutching the book tightly. "I'm not yours, not anymore." I don't know what gave me the idea, but it struck me like a bolt of lightning. If the book was writing my story, maybe I could rewrite it. Maybe I could take control. With a deep breath, I grabbed a pen from my pocket and pressed it to the page. "What are you doing?" the creature roared, its form writhing in anger. "Ending this," I said, forcing the pen to move despite the resistance I felt, like an invisible hand was trying to stop me. The words came slowly at first, like pulling teeth, but then they started to flow. I wrote about the creature, about its hold on the book, about how it was bound to the pages, and then I wrote the one thing I hoped would work. "The keeper is sealed, bound forever to the void from which it came." The room shook violently, the walls cracking and splitting as the creature howled in rage. Shadows swirled around me, trying to pull the pen from my hand, but I held on, writing faster, the words pouring out of me like a flood. "The keeper's power fades. The reader is free." The creature screamed, its form collapsing in on itself, drawn into the book like water down a drain. The glow from the pages intensified, blinding me, until finally everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the room was still. The book sat on the pedestal, its cover now blank, the strange symbol gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like a weight had been lifted. I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaky but steady enough to carry me up the stairs. When I reached the main floor, the library was quiet. Normal. Mr. Henderson looked up from his desk and gave me a small wave. "Everything okay, Emily?" For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just needed to finish up some old business." That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the journal where I'd scrawled my notes about the book. I thought about destroying them, erasing every trace of what had happened, but something stopped me. Instead, I wrote one last entry. "The book is sealed. The keeper is gone. But the story isn't over. It never is." The next day, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay at the library, not after everything that had happened. As I walked out for the last time, I glanced back at the basement door. It was closed, the hidden room locked away. But deep down, I knew the truth. The book wasn't gone, it never would be. And somewhere, someday, someone else would find it. It was supposed to be just another road trip. One of those impulsive, last-minute decisions you make when you're young and desperate for something exciting. Ryan was the one who suggested it. "One last adventure before real life kicks in," he'd said with that easy grin of his. Jess rolled her eyes, but I could tell she was into the idea. Carter shrugged as usual, playing the laid-back guy who's always up for whatever. And me? Well, I figured, why not? What else was I going to do with my weekend? We packed up Ryan's beat-up Jeep and hit the road early Saturday morning. The plan was loose: drive through the Colorado mountains, camp out under the stars, and see where the road took us. It sounded perfect, like something out of one of those coming-of-age movies. But I guess we forgot how those movies usually end. The first few hours were great. We cranked up the music, sang along to songs we didn't know the words to, and laughed until our sides hurt. The mountains were gorgeous, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small in the best way. For a while, it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere, just us and the open road. Then Ryan spotted the turnoff. It was a narrow, winding road cutting through the trees, barely more than a dirt path. The sign at the start was so old and rusted you could barely make out the letters. Ravenwood, it said. That was it. No directions, no distances, just that single word. "Let's take it," Ryan said, his voice laced with excitement. "Who knows where it goes?" Jess groaned. "It probably goes to someone's backyard, or worse, it's a dead end." "Exactly," Ryan grinned. "Adventure." Carter didn't say much, just shrugged like he always did. And me? I should have said no. I should have been the voice of reason. But there was something about that sign, about the way the road disappeared into the forest. that tugged at my curiosity, so I nodded, and Ryan turned the wheel. The trees closed in around us as we drove, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like twilight even though it was barely noon. The air was cooler here, damp and heavy, and the Jeep's tires crunched over gravel and twigs. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the Jeep and our own nervous laughter. After about an hour, we started to get restless. The road twisted and turned, but it never seemed to end. Jess kept checking her phone, but there was no signal. Even the GPS had stopped working. "This is stupid," she said finally. "Let's turn around." Ryan shook his head. "We've come this far. Let's just see where it leads." That's when we saw it. The trees suddenly thinned out and the road widened into a proper street. Ahead of us was a small town, tucked into the valley like it had been waiting for us. It looked normal, quaint even. There was a diner with a neon sign flickering in the window, a hardware store, a gas station. A handful of people wandered the sidewalks, chatting and going about their day. It could have been any small town in America, except for one thing. It wasn't on any map. "Welcome to Ravenwood," Jess read aloud, pointing to a rusty sign on the side of the road. Ryan pulled the Jeep into the parking lot of the diner, grinning like he'd just discovered buried treasure. "Told you this would be worth it." We piled out of the car and stretched, the tension of the drive easing a little. The town felt peaceful, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and everyone knew each other's name. It didn't seem like the sort of place you just stumbled across, though. Something about it felt too perfect, like it had been plucked out of time and dropped here. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hit us like a warm hug. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, brought us menus and chatted like we were regulars. "You kids just passing through?" she asked, her tone friendly, but something else. Cautious, maybe. Ryan grinned. "Yeah, just exploring. This place isn't on the map, though. How long's it been here?" She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a second. "Long enough," she said, her voice softer now. "Not many folks come out this way." After we ate, we decided to explore a bit. The town was small, just a few blocks of shops and houses, but it felt bigger somehow, like it stretched out further than it should. The people we passed were polite, smiling and nodding, but their eyes lingered a little too long, like they were sizing us up. Carter muttered something about how it felt like we were being watched, and I couldn't help but agree. Then Carter found the box. It was small, made of wood, and sitting on a bench in the town square like it had been left there just for us. He picked it up and opened it, revealing a crumpled piece of paper inside. It was a map, old and yellowed, showing the layout of Ravenwood. Except this map wasn't like anything we'd seen before. The streets twisted and turned in impossible ways, looping back on themselves. And surrounding the town was a dense maze of lines labeled only as the woods. "What the hell is this?" Jess asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Carter said, his brow furrowed, "but I think we're going to find out." The map haunted us. Even as we walked back to the Jeep, it felt like it was burning a hole in Carter's pocket. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. The map wasn't just old or weird, it was wrong. Streets couldn't loop back on themselves like that, and no town should be surrounded by nothing but endless woods. "Let's just leave," Jess said once we were back in the car, her voice sharp. "This place is giving me the creeps." Ryan laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a map. Probably some old tourist thing to scare people. It's not like the town's cursed or anything." Carter glanced at him, his jaw tight. "Then explain why the GPS won't work, or why we haven't seen a single road sign since we got here." Ryan waved him off and started the engine. "Fine, we'll leave, all right? Happy?" None of us were happy, and as Ryan drove, it became clear that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as turning around. The road out of Ravenwood should have been easy to follow. We'd just come in on it a few hours ago. But no matter how far we drove, we never seemed to get anywhere. The same buildings, the same trees, the same gas station with its rusted pumps. They all kept showing up like we were driving in circles. At first, we tried to laugh it off, making jokes about small-town charm and bad directions. But after the third time passing the diner, the laughter died. "This doesn't make sense," Emily said softly, staring out the window. "We've been driving straight the whole time." "Maybe the road's looping back," Ryan suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. He gripped the wheel tighter, his usual carefree attitude cracking under the pressure. Jess groaned, pulling out her phone again. "Still no signal. This is insane." Carter pulled the map from his pocket and unfolded it across his lap. "What if this thing is trying to tell us something?" he said, his voice low. "I mean, look at it." We all leaned in to see. The map didn't just show streets, it showed landmarks. The diner, the gas station, the motel we'd passed earlier. But there was something else, something we hadn't noticed before. A faint, handwritten note scribbled in the bottom corner. "You can't leave, not until it lets you." The car went silent. "What the hell does that mean?" Jess finally said, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Carter replied, folding the map back up. "But I don't think it's a joke." Ryan slammed on the brakes, bringing the Jeep to a screeching halt. "All right, that's it," he snapped. "We're walking. There has to be a way out of here, and we're going to find it." We piled out of the car, our nerves frayed. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and quiet, with no sign of another car or person in sight. The air was heavy, and the trees seemed closer now, their branches reaching out like fingers. We walked for what felt like hours, but the further we went, the stranger things became. The road started to twist and bend in ways that didn't make sense, leading us past houses and buildings that we could have sworn we'd already passed. At one point, we ended up back in the town square without even realizing it. "This is impossible," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not moving." "It's the map," Carter said suddenly. "Look." He unfolded it again, and this time the streets weren't just looping, they were changing. New roads appeared where there hadn't been any before, and old ones disappeared. It was like the map was alive, shifting and rearranging itself in real time. "Okay, screw this," Jess said, backing away. "This is some Twilight Zone crap. We need help." But there was no one to ask. The streets, which had been bustling with people earlier, were now empty. The town felt wrong, too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath. And then the whispers started. At first they were faint, like the rustling of leaves, but as we stood there, straining to listen, they grew louder. Words we couldn't quite make out, overlapping and echoing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, clutching my arm. "Yeah," Carter replied, his eyes darting around. "What the hell is it?" The whispers grew louder, and the air grew colder. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, darting between the buildings and disappearing before we could get a good look. It felt like the town was watching us, like it was alive and angry. Ryan grabbed the map from Carter and pointed to a spot near the edge of town, a large building labeled Town Hall. "Maybe there's something there," he said. "Records, maps, something that explains this place." Jess hesitated. "And what if it's worse there?" Ryan didn't answer. He just started walking, the rest of us following close behind. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step. When we reached the town hall, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, empty hallway. The air inside was stale, and the whispers seemed to seep from the walls. I wanted to run. We all did. But something about that place felt important, like it held the answers we needed, or the answers it wanted us to find. The town hall loomed over us, its dark windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there, but Ryan had already stepped inside. The door creaked loudly behind him, like the building itself was waking up. "Ryan, wait!" Jess hissed, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. He didn't stop, and we had no choice but to follow. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the whispers, the ones that had followed us through the town, were louder here, clearer. "Find it, see the truth, don't run." They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, distinct, overlapping, coming from all around us. The main hall was vast and empty, its walls lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their faces seemed blurred, almost unfinished, like they'd been abandoned halfway through being painted. At the far end of the room, a massive map of Ravenwood covered the wall, far more detailed than the one Carter had found. Ryan marched straight toward it, his flashlight beam bouncing off the cracked plaster. "This has to mean something," he muttered, tracing his fingers over the roads and landmarks. "It's just a map," Jess said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's not just a map," Carter countered. He held up the one we'd found earlier, comparing it to the mural. "Look, they're the same, but this one," he pointed to the mural, "it has something new." We all leaned in to see. At the center of the map, where the town square should have been, there was now a swirling black mark, like ink spilled and left to spread. Around it, faint writing appeared, words shifting and rearranging before our eyes. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered. "It's moving." The words finally settled into a single phrase, "the heart of the town." Before anyone could speak, the ground beneath us trembled. A deep guttural groan echoed through the hall, and the whispers turned into full-blown voices, shouting, overlapping, crashing into each other like waves. "What the hell is happening?" Jess screamed, clutching my arm. The map on the wall started to glow, the black mark at its center pulsing like a heartbeat. The floor cracked open beneath it, splitting apart to reveal a staircase spiraling down into darkness. "Are you seeing this?" Carter whispered, his face pale. Ryan didn't hesitate. "This is it, the answer, the way out." "You don't know that," Jess snapped. "For all we know, this could be a trap." Ryan turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "What choice do we have, Jess? Stay here forever? Wait for this place to swallow us whole?" He didn't wait for a reply. He started down the staircase, and one by one we followed. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. The further we went, the colder it got, and the voices grew louder, more desperate. "Remember, don't look away. It's yours." At the bottom, we stepped into a cavernous chamber lit by a faint, unnatural glow. The walls were covered in veins of black, pulsating like living tissue. In the center of the room was a massive, black, swirling void hovering above the ground. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heart, and tendrils of shadow snaked out from it, writhing in the air. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of the town," Ryan said, his voice strangely calm. "It's alive." The tendrils lashed out suddenly, wrapping around Ryan's wrist and pulling him toward the void. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the shadows were too strong. "Help him!" I yelled, grabbing his arm. Carter and Jess joined me, but the void seemed to grow stronger, pulling harder, its darkness spreading across the floor. "It's not just the town," Ryan gasped, his voice strained. "It's us. It's made of us. Our memories, our fears. That's why we can't leave. We're part of it." "What do we do?" Jess cried, tears streaming down her face. Ryan looked at us, his expression shifting from terror to resolve. "One of us has to stay." "What?" Emily whispered, shaking her head. "No, no way." "It won't let us all go," he said, his voice breaking. "It needs someone to keep it alive." "We can find another way," Carter started, but Ryan cut him off. "There's no other way," Ryan yelled, his voice echoing in the chamber. "It's me. It was my idea to come here. I brought us here. I'll stay." Before we could stop him, Ryan yanked himself free of our grip and stepped closer to the void. The tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him in, and the darkness spread, enveloping him completely. "Go!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the shadows. "Get out, now!" The ground trembled violently, and the walls began to collapse. We ran, the voices screaming in our ears, the staircase crumbling behind us. Somehow we made it back to the surface, bursting out of the town hall just as the building collapsed into itself. The streets of Ravenwood were empty, silent. The map Carter had been clutching was gone, disintegrated into ash. "Do you think he's—" Emily started, but her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We just got into the Jeep and drove, the road finally stretching out in front of us, clear and endless. When we reached the main highway, Jess looked around suddenly, her brow furrowed. "Where's Ryan?" she asked. Carter and Emily froze, exchanging confused glances. "Ryan?" Emily repeated. "Who's Ryan?" My stomach dropped. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. My memories of him, his voice, his face, his stupid jokes, were already slipping away, dissolving like the town behind us. By the time we reached the next town, I couldn't remember him at all. I don't know how long we drove. The highway stretched out ahead, empty and quiet, but none of us said a word. The weight of what had just happened, what we couldn't even fully comprehend, sat heavy in the air. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Ravenwood on the horizon, its streets twisting and warping like a living thing. But there was nothing, just trees and asphalt. And yet something was missing, someone. Jess finally broke the silence. What just happened back there?" Her voice was shaky, her usual confidence replaced with a raw vulnerability that I wasn't used to hearing. Emily shook her head, staring out the window. "I don't know. It was like the town wanted us to stay, like it needed us." Carter sat in the back, silent, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of his seat. He'd been clutching the map before we ran, but now it was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. I opened my mouth to say something, to try and make sense of it all, but Jess cut me off. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. Where's Ryan?" The car went silent again. Emily frowned. "Who's Ryan?" I froze, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. "What do you mean, who's Ryan?" "He was just with us. The words caught in my throat. I could picture him, his easy smile, his stupid sense of humor. But the details were slipping away, like sand through my fingers. Carter leaned forward, his face pale. "Ryan? Was that someone we knew?" No, I snapped, gripping the wheel tighter. This isn't right. We can't just forget him. But even as I said it, my own memories of him were unraveling. I couldn't remember what he'd been wearing that day or the sound of his voice. All that was left was a hollow ache, like a part of me had been carved out and left behind. Jess turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. If he was real, then why don't I remember him? Why doesn't it feel like anything's missing? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The road stretched on, the shadows of the trees growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ravenwood was still with us somehow, lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to pull us back. We finally stopped at a diner on the edge of a small town. It was the kind of place that felt normal, grounded. Everything Ravenwood wasn't. The smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted us as we walked in, and for a moment, I almost believed we were safe. The waitress, a cheerful woman in her 40s, brought us menus and made small talk. But when she turned to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the wall behind her, tucked into a corner near the kitchen, was a small framed map. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't even complete, just a faint outline of roads and buildings. But I recognized it immediately. Ravenwood. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. "Where did you get that?" I demanded, my voice louder than I'd intended. The waitress blinked, startled. "Get what, honey?" "That map," I said, pointing. "Where did you find it?" She glanced over her shoulder, frowning. "Oh, that old thing? Been here as long as I can remember. Some folks say it's a map of a ghost town up in the mountains, but I don't know. Why? Is it important?" Before I could answer, Jess grabbed my arm. "Stop," she whispered, her voice urgent. Don't make this worse." "Worse?" I hissed, pulling away. "How can it get worse? Ryan—" I stopped, the name catching in my throat. It felt foreign now, like it didn't belong to anyone, like it was just a word. Carter and Emily were staring at me, their expressions blank. They didn't say anything, but I could see it in their eyes. They'd already moved on. To them, Ryan was just gone, forgotten. I sank back into my chair, my chest tight. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't press further. "Well, let me know if y'all need anything else," she said, walking away. I stared at the map on the wall, trying to piece together the fragments of my memory, but it was no use. Ravenwood had taken something from me, something I couldn't name, couldn't even explain, but I could feel the loss, heavy and suffocating. The rest of the meal passed in silence. When we got back in the car, no one said a word. Jess fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, and Carter and Emily sat quietly in the back, lost in their own thoughts. As I drove, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, it didn't look like me. The face staring back was older, worn, and there was something in its eyes, a shadow, a flicker of something dark and hungry. I blinked, and it was gone. We made it back to civilization eventually, but things were never the same. We stopped talking about the trip, about the town. It became one of those things you bury deep, pretending it never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling my name. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the streets of Ravenwood, twisting and shifting in the darkness, waiting for its next visitors, waiting for me. The rain had been relentless all afternoon, drumming against my windshield as I navigated the winding roads leading to my new home. The real estate agent called it a fixer-upper with charm. To me, it was a fresh start, a way to leave behind the echoes of my failed marriage and the suffocating monotony of city life. When I first saw the listing for the old mansion in Salem, Massachusetts, I thought it had to be a scam. The price was laughably low for such a sprawling property, but the agent assured me it was simply because of its location, secluded, miles from town, and surrounded by dense woods. I figured the isolation was a bonus. After everything I'd been through, solitude sounded like exactly what I needed. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house loomed before me, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. It was larger than I had imagined, its Victorian spires piercing through the mist like dark sentinels. The paint was peeling, and vines crawled along the walls as though trying to reclaim the structure for nature. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the steering wheel, before muttering to myself, "You bought it, Sam. No turning back now." The heavy front door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of dust and aged wood rushing out to greet me. The interior was as grand as it was neglected, ornate molding, a grand staircase and furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. I ran my fingers over the banister, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of use. I spent the first hour unpacking the essentials and exploring the main floor. The dining room was cavernous, its table large enough to seat 20. The kitchen had an old-world charm, with cast-iron fixtures and a wood-burning stove. But it was the hallway that truly captured my attention. Lining the corridor were floor-to-ceiling mirrors encased in elaborate gilded frames. Each one was different, some oval, others rectangular, their edges carved with intricate floral patterns. I stopped in front of one, tilting my head as I examined it. The glass was perfectly clean, not a single speck of dust despite the rest of the house's disrepair. My reflection stared back at me, slightly distorted by the age of the mirror. Creepy, I muttered under my breath, moving to the next. Each mirror gave me the same uneasy feeling, as though my reflection lingered a fraction too long before mimicking my movements. I shook it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I had been driving all day, and my nerves were frayed. As night fell, the house grew colder. I found myself lighting candles in every room, their flickering light casting shadows that danced along the walls. The mirrors, now illuminated by the dim glow, seemed almost alive. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house with a lot of character. Still, I avoided looking directly into the mirrors as I passed by. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft creak coming from the hallway. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound repeated, like footsteps pressing against the wooden floorboards. "Hello?" My voice echoed down the corridor. No response. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the kitchen counter and cautiously stepped into the hallway. The mirrors reflected my every move, the light from the flashlight bouncing off their surfaces. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, but the house was silent again. Then, something caught my eye. In the farthest mirror, the reflection seemed off. The room behind me appeared darker, as though the candlelight didn't reach that far. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight directly at the mirror. That's when I saw it. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind me. I spun around, the beam of light slicing through the empty air. Nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but my reflection seemed different, my expression more strained, my eyes wider. Shaking, I backed away from the mirror and returned to the living room, where I sat on the couch with my head in my hands. Maybe the agent wasn't kidding about the strange rumors. I considered leaving, finding a hotel in town for the night, but something held me back. This was my house now, my escape. Determined to shake off the unease, I headed to the basement to grab my toolbox. I figured keeping busy would stop my mind from spiraling. The basement was damp and cluttered, with stacks of old crates and furniture piled haphazardly in the corners. As I moved a stack of boxes, my flashlight illuminated something tucked away beneath a tarp, a wooden chest, its surface worn and stained. Curious, I dragged it into the center of the room and pried it open. Inside was a collection of old papers, photographs, and a leather-bound book that looked older than the house itself. I opened the book, its pages brittle under my fingers. The handwriting was ornate, the ink faded but legible. One line stood out immediately. "The mirrors show not what is, but what shall be." I stared at the words, a chill running down my spine. From upstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I froze, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the silent house. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, a gust of wind, anything to explain it away. But deep down, I knew this wasn't ordinary. Gripping the leather-bound book in my hands, I bolted up the basement stairs and into the hallway. The mirrors remained intact, their pristine surfaces reflecting the dim glow of the candles I had left burning. Nothing appeared out of place, but the air felt heavier, charged with an unshakable sense of being watched. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, every creak of the old floorboards underfoot amplifying my unease. It wasn't until I reached the living room that I saw the shattered glass. One of the framed photos I had set on the mantel, a picture of me and my ex-wife Claire, lay face down on the floor. The glass splintered across the rug. I crouched to pick it up, my hand trembling as I turned the frame over. The photograph itself was untouched, but the cracks in the glass seemed deliberate, as if forming a web around my face. "Great," I muttered, setting the frame aside. "Just what I need. Bad omens." But I couldn't shake the nagging thought that it wasn't random. Something about this house, these mirrors, was getting under my skin. I glanced at the book still in my hands, the line about the mirrors looping in my mind. The mirrors show not what is, but what shall be. My curiosity overpowered my fear. I had to know more. I sank into the couch, flipping through the brittle pages under the flickering candlelight. The entries were fragmented, some written in hurried scrawls, others in meticulous script. Whoever had written this book had been obsessed with the mirrors, documenting visions they claimed to have seen, scenes of laughter, tragedy, and death. One entry caught my attention. They do not lie, yet they do not speak truth. They guide the hand, whether it wills or not. A chill crawled down my spine. Were the mirrors some kind of trick, a hallucination? Or worse, something that manipulated reality itself? Determined to test it for myself, I returned to the hallway. The mirrors stood silently, their gilded frames gleaming in the low light. I stopped in front of one near the end of the corridor and stared into it, half expecting something to lunge at me from the reflection. Instead, I saw the kitchen, bathed in daylight. It was ordinary at first glance, except for the detail that caught my attention. A plate of food left on the counter, with steam curling into the air. I blinked, confused. I hadn't cooked anything since arriving, and the kitchen was currently dark and untouched. But the scene in the mirror was so vivid, so real. I backed away, my chest tightening. The moment I turned, a thought struck me. I could change the future it showed. If the mirrors truly influenced what would happen, maybe I could use them to my advantage. To test my theory, I entered the kitchen and deliberately placed a plate on the counter. No food, no steam, just the empty plate. For good measure, I turned it upside down. Then I went back to the mirror, half expecting it to show the same image as before, but it didn't. The scene had changed. The kitchen was empty now, just as I had left it. The realization hit me like a jolt. The mirrors didn't just show what would happen. They showed what could happen, and if I intervened, I could alter it. Relief mingled with exhilaration. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I had some semblance of control, but the feeling didn't last. As I moved to the next mirror, I saw something that stopped me cold. It showed the living room dimly lit by candlelight, just as it was now. Only in the reflection, I wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind the couch, motionless. Its form was human-like, but its edges wavered as though it were flickering in and out of existence. My throat went dry as I glanced back at the living room, finding it empty. I turned back to the mirror. The figure hadn't moved, but it was still there, as real as the couch it stood behind. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But even as I tried to convince myself, a cold draft swept through the house, snuffing out the candles one by one. The darkness was instant, oppressive, and I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam piercing through the shadows. "Okay, Sam," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. "You're imagining things. It's just an old house playing tricks on you." But then I heard it again, a faint creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They came from the hallway, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each step. Gripping the flashlight like a weapon, I edged toward the sound. The beam of light revealed the mirrors, their reflections as still and silent as ever. But just as I reached the center of the corridor, I saw it, my reflection in the nearest mirror, frozen mid-step. I hadn't stopped moving. A wave of nausea rolled over me as my reflection tilted its head, a small, knowing smile curling at the corner of its lips. My own lips. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The smile vanished, and my reflection resumed mirroring my movements as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted for the living room, slamming the door behind me. The book sat on the coffee table where I'd left it, taunting me with its cryptic warnings. Somehow I knew this was only the beginning. The storm outside had worsened, thunder rattling the windows and rain lashing against the glass. Inside, the house felt colder than ever, the kind of chill that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I sat on the couch, clutching the book like a lifeline, my mind racing. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just in my head. The mirrors, those damned mirrors, were more than reflections. They showed me things I couldn't explain, things I didn't want to believe. But the figure in the reflection, the way it smiled at me, wasn't something I could ignore. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. The house felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for something. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Driven by desperation, I flipped through the pages of the book, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The words were fragmented, disjointed, as if the author had been unraveling as they wrote. "To break free, one must not trust the glass, but neither can they ignore it. The mirrors guide, but they also bind. The cycle feeds on belief. What you see becomes what you are." I slammed the book shut, frustrated and terrified. If the mirrors were manipulating me, showing me what I feared most, then they were feeding on my reactions. But how could I fight something so intangible? A sudden crash echoed from the hallway, louder than anything I'd heard before. I jumped to my feet, flashlight in hand, and hesitated before stepping toward the door. My breath came in short gasps, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the hallway, the scene before me stopped me cold. One of the mirrors, the largest one at the end of the corridor, had shattered. Jagged shards littered the floor, their reflective surfaces catching the dim light and distorting it into fractured images. In the center of the broken glass stood my reflection. Not me, but my reflection. It moved independently, stepping closer to the shards, its features twisted into a mockery of my own. The smile from earlier was back, broader now, its eyes glinting with malice. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, without warning, it raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Before I could react, the fragments on the floor began to shift, dragging themselves across the wood with a screech that set my teeth on edge. They moved as though pulled by an invisible force, rearranging themselves into a jagged circle at my feet. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath now, each exhale a puff of white in the dim light. The flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness.
"Stop!"
I shouted, backing away from the circle.
"I don't know what you want, but—"
A voice cut through the silence, low and rasping like wind through broken windows. "You know." The words didn't come from the reflection. They came from everywhere. Above me, behind me, within me. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, I don't." The shards of glass began to glow faintly, their light pulsating like a heartbeat. My reflection stepped forward, its movements eerily fluid, and I realized it wasn't stopping. It was crossing the boundary between the mirror and reality. "Stay back!" I yelled, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a piece of the broken frame. I held it in front of me like a weapon, though I had no idea how to fight something that wasn't even real. The figure hesitated, its head cocking to one side as if amused by my feeble attempt at defense. Then it lunged. I swung the wooden frame with all my strength, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. The momentum sent me staggering, and I fell into the circle of glass. The moment my body touched the shards, a searing pain shot through me. It wasn't physical, it was something deeper, as though the mirrors were tearing apart my very essence. Images flooded my mind, scenes flashing so quickly I couldn't process them. I saw myself wandering the house, aimless and hollow. I saw the shadowy figure, no longer separate but part of me. And finally, I saw the house itself, empty and decaying, with only one occupant left, me. "No," I gasped, struggling to push myself out of the circle. "That's not me. That's not my future." The glowing intensified, and the figure loomed over me, its twisted smile now inches from my face. "You made it so," it whispered, its voice a chilling echo of my own. Desperation surged through me. I reached out, grabbing one of the glowing shards and driving it into the figure's chest. To my astonishment, it recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The light in the shards dimmed, and the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The figure let out a guttural scream before dissolving into nothingness, leaving me gasping for breath on the floor. But as I looked around, I realized the mirrors weren't done with me. The remaining glass shimmered, and the fractured reflections began to reassemble themselves, not into mirrors, but into doors. Each one opened onto a void, infinite and dark. I knew then that the house wasn't letting me go. The void behind the doors was alive, swirling and pulsating like a living nightmare. Each fractured shard of glass reflected pieces of myself, distorted, broken, and twisted. The doors loomed, their dark openings beckoning me to step through, though every instinct in my body screamed to stay away. The air was thick with a suffocating energy. My reflection, though gone, had left something behind, a presence that was both around me and within me. I could feel it, coiling inside my mind, feeding on my fear. The whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. "You can't escape. You are already ours. Step through and see the truth." I staggered to my feet, clutching the shard of glass I had used to drive away the figure. Its edges dug into my palm, drawing blood, but the pain was the only thing grounding me. I stared at the doors, the voids within them shifting and writhing like shadows in water. I knew I had to make a choice. Stay here, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and manipulation, or confront whatever was waiting for me on the other side. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the corridor. "I'm done playing your games!" The mirrors trembled, their frames vibrating as though in response. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single, ominous voice. "Then step through, Samuel." The largest door opened wider, its darkness yawning before me like the mouth of some ancient beast. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward it, each step heavier than the last. The shard in my hand glowed faintly, its light pulsing in sync with my racing heartbeat. When I crossed the threshold, the world around me dissolved into nothingness. I was falling, weightless and directionless, through a void that stretched infinitely in all directions. The mirrors were gone, but their influence remained. Images flickered around me, scenes from my life, fractured and fragmented. My childhood, my failed marriage, the moment I signed the papers for this cursed house, and then something new. I saw myself in the house day after day, wandering aimlessly through its halls. My reflection was gone, but I could see the emptiness in my eyes, the slow unraveling of my mind. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed the others before me. "No," I whispered, clenching the shard tighter. "That's not my future." The void responded, the images shifting to show something darker. I saw the figure again, but this time it was fully me, standing in the hallway, smiling that twisted smile, beckoning to the next victim who would enter the house. Rage boiled within me. I wasn't going to let this place win. I wasn't going to let it turn me into that. With a scream, I raised the shard and drove it into the darkness itself. The void shuddered, and for a moment I felt resistance, as though I had struck something solid. Light erupted from the point of impact, blinding and all-encompassing. The void screamed, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, deep in my bones, in the very fabric of my being. The darkness writhed, fracturing like glass under pressure, and then it shattered. I was back in the house, sprawled on the floor of the hallway. The mirrors were gone, their gilded frames empty. The air was still, the oppressive energy lifted, but the house wasn't the same. The walls were decayed, the floorboards rotting beneath me. It was as if decades of neglect had caught up in an instant. The grand mansion I had entered was now little more than a husk, its former glory reduced to ruins. I pushed myself to my feet, clutching my bleeding hand. The shard was gone, but the cut in my palm remained, a thin line of blood trailing down my wrist. I made my way to the front door, half expecting it to resist me, but it swung open easily. Outside, the storm had passed. The air was crisp, and the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. I didn't look back. Months later, I learned the house had been demolished. A fire had gutted the structure not long after I left, leaving nothing but ash and rubble. The news brought me no comfort. Even now, I can't look at my own reflection without feeling a twinge of unease. Sometimes when I glance in the mirror, I think I see it, that faint, knowing smile at the corner of my reflection's lips. The house may be gone, but I know its curse lingers. It's in me now, a shadow I can't escape. And somewhere I know the cycle continues.